Yo, fam. This is going to be episode 2. I'm actually doing a series. I don't know how many I'm going to do today, but this is going to be episode 2 of a podcast series I'm doing on emotional sobriety, talking about a lot of the stuff out of ACA. It's a 12-step program for adult children of alcoholic and dysfunctional families. And I'm going to post it on the website, on the podcast soon as well. So let me get this thing rolling 1 second. Yo, fam. This is episode 2 on the series we're doing on emotional sobriety. So I was reading out of chapter 1 of the ACA Big Red books. And last episode I covered an overview of the 12 traits of an adult child. It's actually referred to as the laundry list. And I went through a couple variations on adult children and codependent. So if you haven't listened to that episode yet, go back and listen to it. It's episode 1, and we're going to get into episode 2. Now, what's interesting about this part of the chapter, it says the other laundry list. And basically, for every characteristic of a laundry list, the traits we talk about, there's also an opposite. In the 12 steps in AA, Narcotics Anonymous, etc., we're taught to find our character defects. We do step 4 is we do a moral inventory. We try to figure out what our character defects are and shortcomings, and we try to get rid of them. But with the help of a sponsor, if he's good or she's good, she'll teach you that for every defect, there's also an asset. So oftentimes, people in recovery, we think we're just bad people. We're morally flawed, that we're not worthy. But through the help of the 12 steps, we can find out we actually have a lot of assets. But in this case, when we're talking about the 14 traits of an adult child, it's often quite, victim of. So a lot of people had these maybe more tumultuous childhoods, and they were the victim of in a lot of ways, but this is the other side of the laundry list, and here we go. It says, before we write in great detail about the original laundry list, we must note that most of the 14 traits have an opposite. Our experience shows that the opposites are just as damaging as their counterpart. For example, if we feared authority figures, as the first trait suggests, we also become authority figures to our children, spouses, and others. When we stop to think about it, we realize we were feared as authority figures. If we lived our life from the viewpoint of a victim, which is trait 5, then many of us have become persecutors and perpetrators who created victims. And this is something that's quite relevant and a bit of a smack in the face for me, is because when I first started going to these meetings, I realized how much I used intimidation with my son. I realized how much I am so easygoing, but I'll draw really hard lines in the sand with my wife, mostly around, don't you try to control me. Don't let me even think that you're trying to manipulate me or take advantage or, whatever. Now, these are my words, not hers. But it was a bit of a kick between the you-know-whats to realize that although I am fearful of being found out or fearful of authority figures, and I recreate that in not only where I was scared of my parents just of getting in trouble because they were pretty strict, but equally, I've made my wife an authority figure. She's quite a strong-willed, organized woman, and I've created this situation where now she's the enemy, and she's trying to control me, and I want to fight against that. But I've also set myself up in situations to either have a boss that is that I fear, or have a boss that I don't want to get in trouble with. And when I think of myself in leadership positions, I think of, and I've always been insecure in that area, because I think of having to lead by managing, manipulating, controlling, being feared. And I instinctually know that's not right. And that maybe that's one of the reasons why I've never tried to gravitate towards leadership roles is I don't feel confident in my ability to lead. I typically take a secondary role, or I usually played number 2 or number 3 to number 1. But this is interesting because as much as you may identify with some of these 14 traits, there's also an opposite that we perpetuate this thing generationally, and that's why a lot of times these behaviors have been passed down 3, 4, 5, 6 generations behind, and if we don't stop and make a change, we're guaranteed to pass that on to our children. If we got guilt feelings for standing up for ourselves, which is trait 7, we could also feel guiltless by shaming someone verbally. We could take from others what was not ours without feeling guilty. These examples represent the reverse side of the laundry list. Many of us would like to deny that we have been a dominating authority figure, but we have. We don't like to think about victimizing others or projecting blame onto them, but we have. Many of us have reenacted what was done to us, thinking we were justified. Some of us have engaged in fights that go beyond mere words. We have slapped and slugged others in a fit of rage. Some of us have used violent cursing with threats of physical harm to intimidate others. As few adult children have willingly committed crimes. Yeah, of course I have. We have stolen merchandise, written bogus checks, or embezzled money for various reasons that don't hold weight in the light of our expectations. We can feel shame or disgust when we think about our actions. This is healthy guilt, which is different from toxic guilt, which we were raised under. Some of the notes that I've made in here talk about, I feel like this is an area I feel most guilty about currently when I use intimidation and authority in my wife. I've talked about that already. Let's see, our behaviors, whether we're victims or creating victims, highlight the truisms in these rooms, which is ACA is not an easy program to work, yet the effort it takes to work the program is far less than the effort it takes to live in codependency or trying to control others or circumstances out of our control. If we apply half the effort as we did in ACA, which we apply to living codependently, we will see amazing results. We will find clarity and self-worth. And in AA and NA, it says that we apply half the effort in our recovery as we did finding ways and means to get more and finding ways to drink and use, that we're destined for success. But oftentimes we don't realize how much effort we put into staying high or using or staying in these relationships because it's so natural and it's so ingrained in us. We will need help. We will need acceptance from others when we cannot accept our help, when we cannot accept ourselves. We do not need to shame ourselves or dive into self-condemnation, but we must be honest about our behavior. We sometimes need a reminder that we are acting destructively and should consider rethinking our behavior. ACA allows us to admit to our behavior in a safe place without judgment from others. By working the program, we learn to recognize that we are thinking like a victim or persecutor and to talk about it. We reparent ourselves to gentleness and self-love, and I think that's interesting. It's probably part of my leadership comment earlier, is most of the time I have black and white thinking. I'm either thinking like a victim or I'm thinking like a perpetrator. I'm either above you or I'm below you. That's one of the things that I always focus on in my recovery program is being right-sized. When I am not better than or less than, I'm right-sized and equal, magically, I don't have the fear, the judgment. Everything just works for me. It's not as big of an issue. But this is what they're talking about here. Acting like a victim for me, this is some of my notes. acting like a victim for me, saying I can't do it, I need help, show me how, I'm not good enough, or I'm not good at that. What I really want is for you to do it for me. I'm a persecutor when I make my wife uncomfortable on purpose in the name of a joke, then laugh when she gets upset. That's just a manipulative, perpetrating way, which is oftentimes in relationships, and this is what I work with my guys that I mentor a lot about, is most of the time it's never about our spouse. It's never about our parents. It's never about a kid. It's always about us. Somewhere deep within our subconscious, we're scared of something. We're scared we're not going to get what we want. We're scared we're going to lose what we have. We're scared things aren't going to work out. And what we do is we project that on the people around us. And we probably are skilled at justifying. We're skilled at making it look as if it's their fault. We've got a history, a lifetime of doing that. It's always about us and rarely about our spouse. Reviewing the laundry list. The following text offers great detail on the characteristics, and this is actually what inspired me to do this series. One of our members of our community asked about a podcast on emotional sobriety, and it's kind of led me down this path. And so let's go into detail on trait 1. Trait 1, we became isolated and afraid of people and authority figures. Adult children often live a secret life of fear. Sorry about that. Fear, or sometimes terror, is one of the connecting threads that links the 14 traits together. 2 of the first 3 traits describe our fear of people. While many adult children appear cheerful, helpful, self-sufficient, most live in fear of their parents and spouses in addition to fearing their employer. Boy, I tell you what, again, I want to be conscious of my parents, how I was raised, etc. Because again, most of my memories are absolutely fond memories, and my parents didn't do anything that I thought was out of the ordinary or abusive, etc. Although there was spanking back then, so I distinctly remember not wanting to upset my parents, or this was a big one. As I became a teenager, any time my dad would show up, my first thought was knot in the stomach, wondering, did I do something wrong? Now, here's what's interesting about that, is I was a kid that was acting a bit of a fool. I was always kind of kicking the line. I was always trying to break a few rules. At some point, 13, 14, 15 years old, I started drinking alcohol and doing drugs, stealing stuff, whatever. Regular, for the people I was hanging out with, regular kid stuff. But every single time, and it probably stemmed from one time I got in trouble. The school called the parents. My dad came home early and whooped me, right? And so from then on, if my dad showed up anytime before 5 o'clock, I instantly was scared that I got found out, that I did something wrong, even when I didn't. All right, that's an odd situation. I also was worried. Like I said earlier, I've set up my wife to be an authority figure. She's quite particular. She's an A-type. She's a doer, and oftentimes I set it up where she's the enemy and the authority figure, and my job is to combat and fight against the authority figure. The other thing is, at work, I've always thought of myself as an entrepreneur. I'm a huge fan of Gary Vee, but what I realized was I have entrepreneurial tendencies. And the example of that is I've, as much freedom and autonomy as I have had professionally, I always have a boss. When I was 18, I got my real estate license. A real estate agent, you're technically an independent contractor, but I worked for someone. I had a boss, a broker who paid commission. Generally speaking, I could do whatever I want, but I still had a boss to answer to. Every sales job I've been into, I never wanted to work my way up into management. I like sales because I could kind of do whatever I want as long as I performed. If I want to make more money, I'll work harder. It's a meritocracy. You make what you eat what you kill in a sense. But I always had a boss that I could rebel against, and I was always scared that I was going to get found out. Same thing in this job that I have. Even though I love it, I'm always waiting to get that phone call to say, "You've been doing something wrong. What are you doing? I saw you looking on LinkedIn. Who knows?" Even when I'm not doing something wrong, I think I did something wrong. Others are constantly afraid of failing. Finances, imagined health problems, or world disasters. How many people do you know that have not only do they have an overwhelming fear of failure, but they got an overwhelming fear of success, or they're obsessed with world disasters, on what's going on out there politically. The world's coming to an end if this politician gets elected. Global warming, this is the worst thing ever. The pandemic, it's the worst thing ever. Not that they're not bad, but the obsession that some people go into, and this overwhelming responsibility that they got to do something about it. Imagine health problems. They get so worried and anxious and stressed about things that they actually get physically sick, or they think they're getting sick. This is one of the biggest struggles that I have, is my finances. One of the promises we talk about in adult children is fear of financial insecurity will leave us. We talk about that in AA as well. And boy, I tell you what, whether I'm behind or ahead, I'm always waiting for the shoe to drop. I never have enough. It's never good enough. Even the year I made more money than I could ever imagine, it wasn't enough. I'm always worried about finances. Even down to, like, my wife takes care of the finances, and a lot of times I just put my head in the sand. I do not want to look at it. That's just another example of I'm waiting for the shoe to drop, and financial insecurity perpetuates that cycle of something going wrong. They have a sense of impending doom, or that nothing seems to work out. Even the seemingly bold adult child who shows bravado can be covering up a deep sense of feeling unsafe or unlovable. The amount of people out there, you can't just say someone that is, a victim is someone that's unsuccessful, or that's real, quote unquote, the traditional victim type mentality. But how many people out there are uber successful, and the drive that they have is that they're not good enough, someone said they can't do it, that they ultimately feel unlovable, and they think that if they are uber successful, that they're going to get the affirmation that they need, only to find out that when they get that affirmation, it's not good enough. There's still a hole. In some of the other 12-step fellowships, we talk about trying to fill a God-sized hole with drugs, alcohol, people, girls, money, gambling, etc. Let's see, at the core of these thoughts is usually the fear of being shamed or abandoned. Shame is the deep sense that our souls are inherently flawed. Abandonment means more than being left alone or left at a doorstop. That's another thing. Learning, if you discover that these traits relate to you, even if you're not a drug addict or alcoholic, etc., we talk about this isn't a moral deficiency. This is a disease, a dis-ease. And so we aren't bad people trying to get good. We're sick people trying to get well. And that's what I want to inspire you to do, is inspire and encourage emotional sobriety. Even if the drugs and alcohol are long gone, if your emotions aren't stable, oftentimes you're acting the same and or worse than we were when we were drinking and using. Shame and abandonment are two of the most identifiable traits of a dysfunctional home. Among other factors, they are two of the conditions that help produce an adult child, whether alcohol or drugs are in the home or not. Adult children from all family types not only feel shame deeply, but we believe we are shame. In some crisis, adult child shame is so pervasive that it can paralyze a person's body and mind. Adult children have described shame attacks, which can cause physical illness or And age regression. During age regression, an adult child can feel physically small. Even vision can be affected when shame is released into the body. An intense shame episode can cause room dimensions to appear warped and lighting to appear odd. Many adult children have difficulty fully breathing during these moments. Talk about how our emotions can cause physical ailments. They talk about oftentimes, some illnesses are in the head. I remember when my wife was in and out of the hospital, they kept saying, are you stressed? Or stressed at work? And quite frankly, she was. A lot of my wife's ailments, her physical and medical ailments, have come from her emotions, emotional distress from chronic fatigue. They thought she had. It wasn't chronic fatigue. It was the stress she took on at work. She took on at work. It wasn't a stressful job. She took it on, even down to her depression that she shared about recently about being suicidal. Has a lot to do with anxiety, depression, control, trying to manage well. Next paragraph. Abandonment can take many forms. One form is as simple as the parent leaving a child alone without returning, or it can involve parental perfectionism in which the child's behavior never measures up. Parents abandon their children when they fail to praise or recognize a child's true effort to please the parent. Instead, most parents are quick to criticize. Where's that? Quick to criticize and correct the child's behavior, but rarely find time to praise the child or to build confidence for good choices. As a result, most adult children have a critical parent inside, which means it's parent's voice being critical or beating themselves up, whether it was perceived or it really is their own interpretation. This critical inner parent berates or undermines a person at almost every turn. This critical inner parent is a form of self-abandonment. Shame and abandonment. Shame and abandonment. That is how our dysfunctional families controlled us as children. We came to see our parents as authority figures who could not be trusted, and didn't trust their anger. I can remember we transferred this fear to our adult lives. And we fear our employers, certain relatives, and group situations. We fear authority figures or became an authority figure ourselves. I'll tell you what, that's kind of one thing where when I think of my childhood and my parents is, my parents kind of bickered a lot. The thing I remember them fighting about the most was either my dad's drinking or finances. One thing that my mom really got under her skin was she did most of the child rearing, even though she worked full time as well. But boy, she did not want my dad coming in and having anything to say about how she was raising us kids. And touche, if she's doing all the work, he don't need to come in and criticize. I do, now that I mentioned that, I do remember my mom often saying that she felt like my dad was critical, etc. But I think of, later I'm going to talk about the 5 types of families that identify with having a drug user and alcoholic in the home. Mental health, hypochondriacs, sick parents, strict, rigid, religious type or military type families, and all of them rule with the fear of shame, abandonment, and guilt. I think of my dad, who had a paralyzed, my grandmother was paralyzed. She could only move her arm. So here they were, 3 kids. Mom was paralyzed. How do you think she was able to manage the 3 kids? I have to imagine you have to get real creative. You can't move. You're a mom. You can't move. You can't do anything. You can't spank them. And you got to get creative. And I would only imagine using shame, using guilt, trying to manipulate the kids to do what the heck they want, and all the kids are doing is being rambunctious. Think on the other side, my mom's side. being raised in a Church of Christ children's home, talk about the shame and guilt that is wielded with religion. Even if you think these thoughts, you're going to hell. Thinking it is just as bad as doing it. And so you often hear the joke of recovering Catholics that Catholicism, showers their people with guilt. That's how they, manage, manipulate, and control. But these are all really, I think that is the most prominent through lines with most 12-step fellowships, or even people that are struggling with addiction, anxiety, depression, mental health issues, is shame, guilt, and abandonment. Throw in fear. Shame, guilt, abandonment, fear, insecurity, self-worth. They're so in line. And Brene Brown talks a lot about shame. It is not that normal people don't have shame. Everybody has shame in some sense of the word. But when it is overdeveloped, if it's a paralyzing issue, or you focus so much more on other people and ignore yourself and what you need, what happens is people stay in jobs that they absolutely hate because they don't think they can get another one. They stay in marriages that they cannot absolutely stand because they don't think that they're worthy to get out. They stay in abusive relationships. I mean, just think of the different variations that this causes. Anyway, that's it for this episode. That was trait 1. We became isolated and afraid of people and authority figures. If you know somebody that could benefit from this, or you identify, I'd love to hear from you, man. Give me a shout out. Share it with a friend. Leave me a comment. And most importantly, make sure you like and subscribe. Holler at your boy. Jip.